let me start out by saying that the theme of this play, obviously, as everybody in the audience knows, is a universal theme. In fact, just a few days ago, a new play called Why We Left Brooklyn opened up at the 4th Street Theater on the Lower East Side. There was a review in the Times a couple of days, and it's about a bunch of young people who have gone forth to Brooklyn, this being 2013 instead of 1931, and are debating whether to stay or whether to go back home to their native cities. So this is a kind of universal theme. And what I'd like to do is set up this play a little bit as best I can in its historical context, talk a little bit about George Kelly as a playwright and his career, and talk about the failure of this play, because this play was a real watershed in his life. It was a failure that sent him to Hollywood, where he worked for a few years at MGM and really authored a script for one film before coming back to Broadway 5 or 6 years later. The first thing to say about it is, of course, that the play premiered in 1931, exactly the point at which the Depression hit New York like a whirlwind. The 1930-31 theatrical season, which it was part of, had 197 Broadway productions. To us, that sounds enormous. But the year before, there'd been 249. And at the year-end survey of the season, the Times noted this and noted that just the economic situation had hit the theater, but it was more than that. People seemed to lose their faith, in a sense, in the world that they were living in. It's interesting to note that the hit of that season is a play that I'll bet a lot of us know, Kaufman and Hart's Once in a Lifetime. And remember, if you know the play, it's a hilarious farce about going forth. It's about a bunch of vaudeville actors who see vaudeville dying under them and decide to go to Hollywood to enter the new industry. And it ends very happily. The young man who goes forth is a sort of amiable idiot named George, who becomes a sensation in Hollywood by filming a movie with all the lights turned off on the soundstage. And for this, he's hailed as a genius, and that's how the play ends. A very interesting parallel to Philip Goes Forth, because it seems to be almost Philip Goes Forth upside down. Philip Goes Forth lasted 97 performances, so it was a respectable run, but by George Kelly's standards, it was a failure. The real failure of the season was something called Gasoline Gypsies, which lasted for one performance, and I don't know anything about it. It's kind of, that's the basic context for this play. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the typical Kelly play, as I see it. And of course, the real expert on this is the man who was here for the talk back the other day. Now I'm sort of, Jonathan, can you? Foster Hirsch, yes, who wrote the best standard book on George Kelly called George Kelly. And I'd encourage anybody who's interested to read that book. But it seems to me that in this performance, we saw everything that's typical about George Kelly as a playwright. He had started in vaudeville. The rumor is that he left school after the 4th grade and then began acting in vaudeville, eventually acting in short plays in vaudeville, then writing short plays for vaudeville. And then when vaudeville started to die, he made the move to the Broadway stage. And I think these vaudeville plays, I don't want to get too historical about them, but they went way back into variety theater, way back into the 1800s. If you went out for an evening in the theater in, let's say, 1860, you'd very often go to something called a concert saloon, and you'd see a variety show. And the variety show would include all sorts of acts: jugglers, staged prize fights, songs, but also almost always a play, sometimes a comedy, but not always. A very short, carefully designed, impactful play. And that, I think, is where George Kelly started in that kind of thing. But there was a change. These music halls, the most famous one was at 444 Broadway. The building is still there, although it's not a theater. And at the old 444, almost only men went. drink was served in the theater. It was not a family form of entertainment. The great figure in the history of turning variety from that sort of raffish, disreputable kind of outing to the vaudeville most of us think about was Tony Pastor, as I'm sure everybody knows. And he in 1881 opened his most famous theater on Union Square in what had been Tammany Hall. And what he did was make vaudeville family friendly. You could still buy a drink, but you didn't have people walking up and down the aisle selling you drinks. And also the fare was supposed to be strictly family friendly. And as a result, the plays that he produced and the people produced like him after the full flowering of vaudeville in the early part of the 20th century tended to be a great deal like Philip Goes Forth, and I think also like a lot of other plays. Let me point out some of the things that I think are typical. What Kelly was famous for, and I think deservedly, is his ability to kind of make you forget you're in a theater for the time being, where there's a lot of back and forth among the characters, where props are being placed back and forth. I think you really see that in this play at the beginning of the second act, when you have Mrs. Ferris's rooming house, and you have Haynes the composer and Philip and his friend and La Creole, Miss Creole as she's known, doing all sorts of things with props, talking back and forth. It's very entertaining. It's very funny. You almost forget a play is going on. And if you go back and look at that scene as it's written in the play, I was reading for a particular thing that I think was really effective in this production, was when Miss Creole is opening up that dingy brocade. She's chattering back and forth as she does. That's her character. But what makes it come alive is the way she's working with the prop. She's gradually unwrapping the wrapping and gradually showing the prop to the scene. Mrs. Oliver, I think, is a very typical kind of vaudeville character, the character who's meant to play to the rafters. So all of that sort of byplay, all of that incredibly deft, to me anyway, conversation that goes on, that was part of vaudeville because you had to get it into a very short space. And there couldn't be longueurs, there couldn't be places where the action sapped or anything like that. And the other thing that a vaudeville play almost always needed, and this goes back to Pastor and the middle class thing, is it needed some kind of moral sorting out. At some point in the play, there had to be a moment when the truth was faced, at least the truth as George Kelly saw it, and there had to be a moment where the audience thought, we aren't here just to waste money, we're getting a moral in the old-fashioned sense, a message to take home. And the message was typically, you might call it Victorian morality, you might call it, maybe more accurately, American middle-class, family-friendly morality, but a kind of morality that says children should obey their parents, wives should obey their husbands, young people should obey old people. Experience is what carries the day. And in a George Kelly play, in almost all of George Kelly's plays, there's a character, and the character in this play is Mrs. Ferris, who at a critical moment in the play stands up and sorts you out but good. And I think kind of that's Mrs. Ferris's role in this play. You know, she forms a kind of unambiguous moral center in the play. And she, of course, is in this play the moment when Philip starts to admit to himself that he really wants to go back to a city that I would guess is Pittsburgh, because it's said somewhere to be 5 hours from New York. And George Kelly came from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, but it makes sense in some ways, but who knows, it doesn't matter to the play. So I think that in many ways is the center of the play, and I think maybe to a 21st century audience, the balance between the comic elements in the play and the serious elements of the play may seem a little new. But then I'm not going to talk too much longer because I'd like to have us have a conversation and take questions if you're interested in asking them. The 1920s, Kelly's career, and it's one of the great careers in the theater of the 1920s, began with a smash hit called
Torchbearers.
Sorry? The Torchbearers. How could I have forgotten it? If you've seen Noises Off, you've seen The Torchbearers. It's a hilarious farce, at least the two first acts of it are, in which an amateur theater company rehearses a play that they're about to give, and the second act is seen from backstage at the actual performance. It's a hilarious slapstick farce. His second play, also a smash hit success, excuse me, is the one most of us, I think, are most likely to have seen, which is The Show Off, about kind of a loud-mouthed businessman, a sort of braggart figure who drives all of his friends and relatives crazy. That's the play, I think, of his that's been produced most. The third play was a turn to a serious play. It was Craig's Wife, and I think this is a play that probably anybody who's acquainted with George Kelly may have seen, probably through the 1950 film of it called Harriet Craig with Joan Crawford. It's about a conniving, power-hungry woman who enslaves her husband and makes her house a prison for him. And there is, in that play, as always in a Kelly play, there's a moment where another character in the play dresses her down. It's a maidenette, actually, who comes down and tells her what she's doing. And the play ends tragically. It won a Pulitzer Prize. It was a success. It was filmed 3 times. But the 3 plays after that, and he wrote 3 plays between that and Philip Goes Forth, were all failures. And they were all largely failures because he was turning toward seriousness. And he was also, I think, turning against the very strong current in popular theater during the 1920s. I won't mention the plays, but Brooks Atkinson, all of these plays got, on the whole, very bad reviews, and they had very short runs, although all of them, I think, are very, very interesting plays. But nevertheless, Brooks Atkinson, the leading critic, stayed with him for these next 3 plays and was respectful, except that with Philip Goes Forth, for some reason, he turned. And he turned really for the rest of Kelly's career. And I'd like to read first of all, this is from his review, 2 things. The first one is from his review of the play on its opening, and the second was, the Times still does this sometimes, in the Sunday paper, the critic would have a second set of thoughts about the play. So I'm going to read first from the review. Perhaps we should swallow it as vaudeville and let the matter rest. For Mr. Kelly plants his gags sagaciously, and he can make things easily amusing by setting his poetess to rhapsodizing ethereally over a dingy strip of cloth or dropping her belongings as she leaves the room. But speaking as an established playwright, Mr. Kelly devoutly wishes they would all go home. His moral would be more easily digested if he had taken the trouble to write a finer play. Philip Goes Forth is a potpourri of drab social comedy, buffoonery, and homiletics. And I think, then the Sunday second thoughts. The initial fact of coming to New York, especially under difficulties, is a sign of courage and enterprise. Staying may not be a sign of moral stubbornness, as Mr. Kelly implies, but of their superior determination to lead their own lives. Furthermore, everyone knows that many of those who have failed to achieve what they desire are quite as able, this is a very sort of stiff 1920-ish, you listen to me sort of style, but furthermore, as everyone knows that many of those who have failed to achieve what they desire are quite as able as many of those who have somehow contrived to get on. Whether they are full-flowered dramatists or muddy-mettled romantics, they bring us fervor and enthusiasm, faith and ambition, and a willingness to learn. What makes this department so disgruntled with Mr. Kelly's new play is the absence of these enchantments in its point of view. I don't know whether it was this review or not, probably not, but in the event, Kelly decided to throw over Broadway and go to Hollywood, where, as I said at the beginning, he spent the next 5 years before coming back, working for MGM and wrote the script for a movie in 1935, Old Hutch with Wallace Beery. I've never seen the film. But he gave a couple of interviews to the press before he left. And the first one is an interview with Ruth Morris in the Times in February 1931. And the article, anybody can look it up on the Times Online, is somewhat snide. But this is a quote from Kelly. "I don't think any field is more fertile in drama than this mad going forth to New York or abroad to take up writing or painting or music, particularly when, as is so often the case, the goers are attracted by the concomitants of the thing. It is perfectly all right for them to try, but the tragic implication lies in their being afraid to go back when, after they've had a taste of the thing and realize the work attached, they find they can't do it at all. They can't bear to return because they haven't shown the hometown, when in many cases the hometown has forgotten all about them." And then, so that's his sort of defense against the critics. When he was just about to leave the city, he gave another interview, and these were, I think, his last words on the subject of Philip. "The Broadway stage has practically no appeal right now for the writer interested in a serious analytical study of the characters and situations. The stage here has temporarily become the mecca of vacationists and college boys who rush in order tickets for a musical or, quote, laugh show, unquote. The discriminating playgoer seems more than ever in eclipse." Well, that's his last words on the subject. I'd like briefly to talk about where I think Kelly was coming from as a writer and a dramatist, and place it in the context of 20s and 30s theater, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. The play that I think makes the most interesting comparison with this is a famous one, Maureen Watkins's Chicago, which is how most of us get our sense of the 20s. I don't know if anybody's read the original play, but the Kander and Ebb musical in plot is virtually identical to it. The two couldn't be closer. And the interesting thing, and there's parallels here with Kaufman and Hart, the 1920s didn't like itself. Writers and dramatists were constantly talking about how hedonistic it was, how opportunistic it was, how money was the only thing that mattered. And yet at the same time, and they satirized that, but there was an undercurrent that I don't think you have so much in Kelly, in which at the same time, they had it both ways. They mocked the greedy, successful figures like Roxy Hart in Chicago. Another famous, it's a novel rather than a play, but 1925, Anita Lois's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Lorelei Lee in the novel is deeply evil, but she's very, very funny. She's very, very smart. She gets what she wants, and we end up simultaneously judging her, but also celebrating her. And I think that's the Roxy Hart kind of thing. The Depression, which I started with, I think is deep inside this play in a lot of ways, because if it has lessons, and although they're not explicit in the play is on the side of being careful. If you're well off, don't take any chances. Stick with the people you know. Keep the family together. And I think kind of in a sense, Kelly, in turning against the 20s, was in a transitional sort of way. He wasn't alone in this. Another famous playwright of the 20s, Philip Barry, and of course we all remember him for the Philadelphia story, thanks mostly to the famous movie, had a very similar career where he was thought of as a comic writer. Then he tried to write serious plays and they failed. He came from a very similar background. So that's the sense in which I think he was, in a sense what Kelly was doing, and I think he may have felt threatened by the fact that his origins were in vaudeville, an art that had all but died out by the time Philip Goes Forth premiered. He was looking back to a way of writing and trying, I think, to revive a way of writing that went back to the early 20th century. And a good example of a short story, not a play. Does anybody know it? Willa Cather's Paul's Case? Again, it's a short story about a young man who goes from Pittsburgh to New York in order to try to be in the theater in some way. and who fails miserably and is destroyed by the experience. Even though I think a good deal of George Kelly's reading came later in his career, he probably might have seen a story like that. But it's certainly a story that's in the same vein as Philip Goes Forth. If you look just 5 years later in the theater, and this is where I'm going to end on, think of some of the things that were produced. Blitzstein's The Cradle Will Rock, and here we're talking about a high depression musical. It was just revived at City Center for a one performance concert reading a few weeks ago, actually. And that was a cutting-edge, hard-driving, unflinching, although fantastic look at the realities of the Depression. The people out of work, the sort of strife between the rich and the poor, or the other, of course, famous person is Clifford Odets, Waiting for Lefty. His first play was 1935. If you put Odets or Blitzstein side by side with Philip Goes Forth, you're looking at a completely different sort of animal. And that's what I have to say on the matter. Would anybody like to? Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.